The recruitment letter arrived on unmarked stationery, cream-colored and heavy, with an embossed seal I didn't recognize. 3 interlocking triangles forming a single eye. Civilian security consultant needed. Fort Knox, Kentucky. Biweekly rotation. Compensation well above federal standard. Psychological evaluation and extended background check required. What struck me as odd wasn't the vagueness, but the specificity of what they didn't say. No mention of the Treasury Department, no reference to military oversight, nothing about the United States bullion depository that every American assumes is all that exists beneath that famous golden exterior. I should have questioned it more carefully, but 6 months of unemployment and a foreclosure notice have a way of narrowing your options. The psychological evaluation took place in a windowless office in Louisville, administered by a woman who introduced herself only as Dr. Kane. She asked questions that seemed designed to probe the edges of my sanity rather than confirm it. How I felt about secrets, whether I believed in absolute truth, if I'd ever experienced something I couldn't explain. When I asked what position I was actually being evaluated for, she smiled without warmth and said, "Pattern recognition and adherence to structured protocols in high-stress environments." 3 weeks later, I received a phone call from a blocked number instructing me to report to Gate 7 at Fort Knox at precisely 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday. Not midnight, not the top of the hour, 11:47 p.m. exactly. When I asked why that specific time, the voice on the other end simply repeated the instruction and disconnected. My name is Adam Kincaid, and I've spent the last 4 years working a job that has convinced me that everything we think we know about power, wealth, and the hidden architecture of global control is both completely wrong and terrifyingly accurate in ways that would shatter most people's understanding of reality. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That first night, I arrived at Gate 7 with 15 minutes to spare, only to find no visible gate, no guard station, just a section of reinforced fencing that looked identical to every other section surrounding the complex. At exactly 11:47 p.m., a panel in the fence slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a narrow concrete corridor lit by amber lights that cast no shadows. A man in a charcoal suit waited 10 feet inside, hands clasped behind his back, his face so unremarkable that I've never been able to recall specific features, even moments after looking at him. "Mr. Kincaid," he said, not as a question. "I am Facilitator Crane. You will address me by title only. Follow precisely 3 feet behind me. Do not speak unless responding to a direct question." We walked for what felt like 20 minutes through corridors that curved gradually, descending at an angle so subtle I only realized we were going underground when my ears popped. The walls were smooth concrete, interrupted every 50 feet by heavy blast doors, each marked with those same 3 interlocking triangles. Facilitator Crane finally stopped at an unmarked door and produced a key that looked far too old-fashioned for a facility this secure. Ornate brass with teeth that seemed to form symbols rather than simple cuts. Inside, you will find your employment contract and operational protocols. You have exactly 30 minutes to read and sign. Questions may only be asked after contract execution. Compensation begins immediately upon signature. The room beyond was small, almost claustrophobic, containing nothing but a metal desk, a single chair, and a black leather folder embossed with those triangular symbols. I sat down and opened it, my hands trembling slightly from the strangeness of everything so far. The contract was dense with legal language that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify, but certain phrases jumped out. Indefinite non-disclosure continuing beyond termination of employment and/or death of signatory, acceptance of psychological and physiological risks inherent to observation of hierarchical convergence events, acknowledgement that standard legal protections may not apply in contested jurisdictional spaces. The compensation section was shockingly specific. $24,000 per biweekly shift, deposited into an offshore account established in my name, with full medical coverage including specialized psychological rehabilitation if required. Beneath the contract were the protocols, printed on cardstock so thick it felt like wood, each rule numbered in gold ink. Primary operational protocols. Protocol 1. Never make direct eye contact with any participant. Maintain focus on the golden floor markers at all times. If a participant moves to obstruct your view of the markers, Close your eyes and count backward from 13. Protocol 2. Announce your presence before entering any chamber by stating, "Observer entering, acknowledgement requested." Wait for a response before proceeding. If you receive multiple simultaneous responses, withdraw immediately and mark the occurrence. Protocol 3. Physical proximity to participants must not fall below 13 feet at any time. If a participant approaches closer, retreat while maintaining your backward count from 13. If retreat is impossible, assume statuette position until participant withdraws. Protocol 4. Verbal responses must be limited to confirmed, negative, or unable to confirm. No other words are permitted during active observation. Personal pronouns, questions, and elaborations are strictly forbidden. Protocol 5. Continuous counting is mandatory. You must maintain awareness of the exact number of participants in your observation zone at all times. Recount every 3 minutes. Any discrepancy between counts must be immediately reported. Protocol 6. If you observe the gold itself moving, flowing, or displaying properties inconsistent with solid metal, document the occurrence but do not react visibly. Participants can detect startle responses. Protocol 7. In the event of a divergence, described as reality instability, temporal displacement, or geometric impossibility, maintain protocol adherence. Your consistency anchors consensus reality for the duration of observation. The final page contained a signature line above a single sentence printed in red ink. I accept all consequences of bearing witness to the convergence. My hand hovered over the pen for a long moment. Every instinct screamed that this was insane, that I should leave immediately, that no amount of money was worth whatever this actually was. But that foreclosure notice was still sitting on my kitchen counter, and something deeper wanted desperately to know what lay beyond that door. Some part of me that had always suspected the world contained more than the sanitized version we're taught to accept. I signed. Facilitator Crane returned exactly 30 minutes after he'd left, as if he'd been counting every second. He collected the folder without looking at my signature and produced a small pin from his pocket. A triangle within a triangle, rendered in what looked like aged gold. He attached it to my collar without asking permission. This designates you as observer. Participants will recognize it. Your first shift begins in 15 minutes. Follow me to the vestibule. We descended 3 more levels, the air growing colder and developing a metallic taste that coated my tongue. The architecture changed subtly. The concrete walls gave way to older stone, blocks that looked like they'd been quarried centuries ago, and marked with symbols that predated any language I recognized. The vestibule turned out to be a circular chamber about 30 feet in diameter, with 13 doors spaced evenly around the perimeter. The floor was solid gold, polished to a mirror finish and marked with those triangular symbols arranged in complex geometric patterns. In the center stood a simple wooden chair bolted to the floor, facing the largest of the 13 doors. "You will sit here," Facilitator Crane instructed, gesturing to the chair. "Participants will arrive through multiple doors. They utilize the convergence chamber beyond for their assembly. Your sole function is observation and count maintenance. This tablet," he produced a slim device from his jacket, "will be used to document count discrepancies, protocol violations, and divergence events. Questions? What exactly am I observing?" The question escaped before I could stop it. Crane's unremarkable face somehow became even more neutral. "The precise nature of the assembly is not your concern. You are here to ensure proper protocols are maintained. Nothing more. The participants value consistency above all else. Your predecessor failed to understand this distinction." What happened to my predecessor? No longer a relevant consideration. He placed the tablet in my hands. "Your shift ends at precisely 6:13 a.m. If you hear a bell tone, remain seated. If you hear voices speaking in unison, begin counting backward from 13. If you see me before shift end, follow without question." Then he left through one of the smaller doors, which sealed behind him with a sound like grinding teeth. For the first 13 minutes, nothing happened. I sat on that uncomfortable wooden chair, staring at the golden floor markers trying to steady my breathing. The silence was absolute. No air circulation hum, no distant footsteps, nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat growing progressively louder in my ears. At 12:13 a.m. exactly, the largest door opened. They didn't walk so much as manifest, as if they'd been standing there all along and I was only just now being allowed to perceive them. I kept my eyes locked on the floor markers as instructed, catching only peripheral impressions. Dark formal wear, expensive shoes ranging from handcrafted leather to what looked like ornate slippers, movements that seemed to obey slightly different laws of physics than mine. Observer entering, acknowledgement requested, I said, my voice sounding thin and strange in the vast space. Acknowledged, came the response, but it seemed to emanate from the air itself rather than from any individual. Maintain protocols, observer. This assembly weighs the distribution of 17 trillion in asset restructuring. More figures emerged from the other doors over the next few minutes. I counted carefully 13 participants, matching the number of doors. They arranged themselves in the geometric pattern marked on the floor, each standing on a specific symbol. From my restricted view of their feet and lower legs, I noticed details that made my skin crawl. Some stood with perfect, inhuman stillness, others shifted weight in ways that suggested too many joints, and at least 3 appeared to be hovering a fraction of an inch above the gold surface. The assembly proceeded in voices that seemed to harmonize in impossible ways, discussing things I strained not to fully comprehend. The collapse of a currency, the installation of a premier, the redirection of a war. They spoke of human events like chess moves, like inevitable outcomes of equations I couldn't see. Every 3 minutes, I recounted. 13 participants. Always 13. Until the 4th count when I reached 14. My heart hammered against my ribs as I recounted immediately, certain I'd made an error. 14. One of them had split somehow, or another had entered without announcement. I fumbled for the tablet with shaking hands and documented the discrepancy, noting the time, 12:37 a.m. The conversation stopped mid-sentence. The observer has noted an inconsistency, one of them said, and I couldn't tell if the tone conveyed amusement or threat. Interesting. Count again, observer, another voice commanded. I counted with painful precision, following each set of feet, each position on the geometric pattern. 13. Back to 13. I documented this, my fingers nearly dropping the tablet. Reality reasserts, the first voice said. The convergence holds. Continue. They resumed their discussion, but I could barely hear it over the rushing in my ears. Something had been there, someone, and then hadn't been, as if the count itself determined existence. The shift continued with mounting tension. At 1:22 a.m., I noticed the gold floor beneath one participant beginning to ripple like liquid, circular waves emanating from their feet. I documented it without reacting, though every muscle in my body wanted to bolt from the chair. The participants stepped aside, and the gold solidified instantly. At 2:47 a.m., I heard footsteps approaching from a door that hadn't opened, growing louder, then fading to nothing. At 3:13 a.m., during my regular count, all 13 participants turned to face me in perfect unison. I kept my eyes locked on the floor markers, maintained my count, and after a moment that stretched like hours, they turned back to their assembly. The discussion shifted to something that made even less sense. Talk of the 17 bloodlines, the keeper's bargain, and the gold standard of souls. I tried not to listen, tried to focus only on my counts, my protocols, but fragments lodged in my mind like splinters. The Fort Knox convergence has maintained the balance for 73 years, one said. The gold is merely the symbol. The true reserve is stored in flesh and concordance. At 4:31 a.m., one of the participants approached my chair, stopping exactly 13 feet away. I could see expensive Oxford shoes, perfectly polished, and above them the hem of a tailored suit. Observer, the voice said, cultured and ancient and wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Do you understand the function you serve? I wanted desperately to look up, to see the face of something that could discuss the fate of nations like menu items. Unable to confirm, I managed. Wise. Witnesses anchor the convergence. Your observation makes our assembly real in the consensus. Without you, we would be merely probability ghosts, unable to affect the material plane. You give us substance." The shoes turned away, and the participant returned to their position. My mind reeled at the implication that I wasn't just watching, I was somehow empowering whatever this was by the simple act of bearing witness. At 5:47 a.m., the assembly concluded with a phrase spoken in perfect unison by all 13. "The convergence is recorded. The hierarchies align. The distribution proceeds." They departed through their respective doors simultaneously, like a film run in reverse, until I was alone in the vestibule once again. My entire body was drenched in sweat despite the cold, my hands cramping from gripping the tablet too hard. At exactly 6:13 a.m., Facilitator Crane emerged from the same door he'd used earlier. "Follow me." We returned through those descending corridors in silence until we reached a different room than before. This one containing a medical examination chair and monitoring equipment. "Decontamination protocol," Crane explained. "Standard procedure after observation." A woman in a white coat entered, her face as forgettable as Crane's, and administered what she called a cognitive stabilization treatment. A series of injections and a device placed against my temples that created a buzzing sensation deep in my skull. "Helps maintain distinction between observation memory and personal reality," she said clinically. "Prevents integration issues." I wanted to ask what integration issues meant, but I was too exhausted, too overwhelmed by what I'd witnessed. When the treatment ended, Crane handed me a sealed envelope. "Your compensation for Shift 1. Return in 13 days at 11:47 p.m. Questions." "Who are they?" The question emerged as barely more than a whisper. "The assembly operates beyond nominal classification," Crane replied, which wasn't an answer at all. "Your understanding is not required, only your consistency." I left Fort Knox as dawn broke over Kentucky, the envelope heavy in my jacket pocket, my mind struggling to process what I'd seen. At home, I opened it to find a bank statement showing exactly $24,000 deposited into an account I'd never opened, under a bank I'd never heard of, in a country I'd never visited. The next 13 days passed in a haze. I tried researching the symbols I'd seen, the phrases I'd overheard, but every search led nowhere or to conspiracy theory rabbit holes so convoluted they made my eyes blur. I considered not returning, just walking away from whatever this was. But the second payment appeared in my account exactly 13 days after the first, before I'd even completed another shift, as if my continued participation was already assured. The second shift was worse. I arrived at 11:47 p.m. to find Facilitator Crane waiting with another person. A young woman, maybe 30 years old, carrying the same tablet I'd been given. "Observer trainee," Crane explained. "She will shadow your protocols. Instruct her in count maintenance and proper response formulation." Her name was Rebecca Marsh, and the terror in her eyes told me she was exactly where I'd been 13 days ago. "Just do exactly what I do," I whispered as we walked to the vestibule. "Don't look up. Don't ask questions. Count constantly." This assembly included 16 participants instead of 13. They discussed things that made the previous shift seem mundane. Talk of orchestrated collapse, the hunger protocols, and something they called the revelation timeline. Rebecca trembled beside me, and I worried she might break protocols. At 1:43 a.m., one of the participants manifested directly beside her chair, far closer than 13 feet. She gasped and began to stand, but I grabbed her wrist and pulled her back down. "Statuette position," I hissed. "Appendix C." We both froze, utterly still, barely breathing, while the participants circled us slowly. I could smell something like ozone and copper, could feel the temperature drop until my breath misted. After an eternity, the participant withdrew to the proper distance. "The observers maintain discipline," it said, sounding almost approving. "The convergence remains stable." But Rebecca broke at 3:22 a.m., when the gold floor began flowing like water beneath all 16 participants, forming symbols that hurt to see even peripherally. She looked up. I heard her breath catch, a sound that might have been the beginning of a scream, and then she was running, dropping her tablet, bolting for the door we'd entered through. The assembly stopped. "Protocol violation," multiple voices said in perfect unison. "Observer contamination." Facilitator Crane appeared from nowhere, moving faster than should be possible, intercepting Rebecca before she reached the door. He pressed something against her neck, and she crumpled unconscious into his arms. He carried her out without a word, and the door sealed behind them. "Continue observation," the assembly commanded. I sat alone for the remaining 3 hours, counting and recounting 16 participants, documenting every anomaly with shaking hands, trying desperately not to think about what had happened to Rebecca or what contamination meant. When my shift ended, Crane was waiting with the woman in the white coat. "The trainee has been removed from the program," he said flatly. "Do not inquire further. Your performance under stress was acceptable. Additional compensation has been added for protocol maintenance during crisis." "Is she alive?" I couldn't stop myself from asking. No longer a relevant consideration. The third shift, I arrived to find a different facilitator. This one introducing himself as Facilitator Marrow, taller than Crane, with the same aggressively forgettable features. "Crane has been reassigned," he explained without elaborating. "The assembly tonight will include special participants. Extended protocols apply." He handed me a second set of rules printed on black cardstock. Extended protocols for special convergence. Protocol 8. If any participant addresses you by name you have not provided, respond only with observer and recount immediately. Protocol 9. If you observe your own reflection in the gold floor behaving independently of your movements, do not acknowledge it. Continue standard protocols. Protocol 10. If participants discuss events from your personal life, this information is coincidental pattern recognition and must not be engaged with emotionally. Protocol 11. In the event of temporal displacement, experiencing the same moment multiple times, maintain count continuity across iterations. Protocol 12. If you perceive yourself among the participants, you are experiencing convergence bleed. Close your eyes and recite your full name until the perception fades. Protocol 13. Should the assembly exceed 26 participants, ring the bell mounted beneath your chair. Remain seated regardless of subsequent events. My hands went numb reading them. The special convergence began with 18 participants, the largest assembly I'd witnessed. But these were different from before. I could sense it even without looking directly at them. The air vibrated with something that made my teeth ache, and the gold floor seemed to pulse with internal light. They discussed the Ascension Protocol, speaking in technical terms about consciousness harvest, voluntary transference, and the final consolidation of the 17 bloodlines into the singular. At midnight exactly, something impossible happened. I heard my mother's voice. She'd been dead for 6 years, but there she was, clear as a phone call, saying my name. "Adam, baby, why are you here? Why are you helping them?" Protocol 10, I reminded myself frantically. Coincidental pattern recognition. Do not engage emotionally. But tears were streaming down my face as I counted and recounted the participants, as I maintained my focus on the golden floor markers. "Adam." My father's voice joined in, "Dead for 8 years now. You're making a terrible mistake. They're going to use you. They use everyone." I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there listening to the voices of my dead parents emanating from an assembly of things that discussed human civilization like a farm to be managed. But I held position, maintained protocols, and when a participant approached to 13 feet and asked, "Do you hear them? Observer?" I responded with confirmed in a voice barely above a whisper. "They speak from the space between convergence points," the participant explained, though I hadn't asked. "The dead congregate there, drawn to the gold like moths to flame. They cannot harm you, observer. They merely wish to warn you of what you're becoming." At 2:47 a.m., I made my regular count and reached 27 participants. My hand shot beneath the chair, finding the bell mounted there exactly where the protocols had indicated. I rang it once, a clear crystalline tone that seemed to vibrate through dimensions I couldn't see. The response was immediate and terrifying. The walls of the vestibule began to bleed golden light, and new figures emerged from that radiance. Not through the doors, but through the walls themselves. These were different from the other participants, taller, wearing robes that seemed woven from shadow and wire, faces hidden behind masks of hammered gold. Stabilization required. One of them announced in a voice that resonated in my bones. The convergence expands beyond designed parameters. What followed was something I can barely describe. A process that looked like negotiation but felt like surgery. The masked figures rearranging the other participants in new geometric patterns, touching them with long fingers that left trails of light in the air. The number stabilized at exactly 26, as if one participant had been subtracted from reality itself. Balance restored, the masked figures declared, then retreated back into the golden light until only the original assembly remained. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of my own horror and exhaustion. When it ended, Facilitator Marrow escorted me to a different room than the usual decontamination chamber. This one deeper, older, the walls carved with symbols that seemed to predate human language. "You rang the bell," he said, and for the first time, I detected something like emotion in a facilitator's voice. Respect maybe, or fear. Only 3 observers in the program's history have had cause to use it. You witnessed a stabilization. That places you in a unique category. What does that mean? I asked, too tired to maintain proper response protocols. It means you're valuable to the convergence, Marrow replied. They've noticed you specifically. This brings opportunities and considerable danger. The decontamination that night was more intense. Additional injections, longer application of the temple device, and a new procedure involving electrodes placed against my spine. The woman in the white coat explained that they were reinforcing ego boundaries to prevent convergence integration. I wanted to ask what happened to observers who integrated, but I remembered Rebecca Marsh and kept silent. The compensation for that shift was triple the normal amount. Over the following months, the shifts grew progressively stranger and more disturbing. The assemblies discussed things I desperately wished I couldn't understand. Engineered pandemics scheduled for specific years, controlled economic collapses designed to consolidate power, lists of names marked for transition, elevation, or worse, just processing. I learned that the gold in Fort Knox was never about monetary value. The bullion itself was a battery, a physical anchor for something the participants called the Concordance. An agreement made in 1947 between what they termed the 17 bloodlines and entities they never named, but always referred to with reverence bordering on terror. The gold stored something more than wealth. It stored potential, the accumulated belief of humanity in the value of shining metal, transformed through ritual and convergence into a form of power that could reshape consensus reality itself. During my 7th shift, I witnessed what they called a rendering. 3 participants who had apparently violated some unspoken agreement were brought before the assembly in chains that looked like braided light. The sentence was delivered in that unified voice they used for major pronouncements: reduction to base material. I watched through peripheral vision as they were transformed, their bodies flowing like liquid into the golden floor, their screams harmonizing with that terrible unified voice until they were just shapes in the metal, forever frozen in their moment of transformation. The assembly stepped over them without pause, continuing their discussion of agricultural futures and water rights. That night's decontamination included sedation. I woke in my car at a rest stop 40 miles from Fort Knox with no memory of the drive and a message on my phone from an unknown number. Cognitive overflow. Standard response. Return for next scheduled shift. But it was during my 9th shift that everything changed, when I learned exactly how much danger I was truly in. The assembly that night included only 9 participants, and they arranged themselves in a new pattern. A triangle within a triangle within a triangle. Facilitator Marrow had been replaced by someone calling himself Facilitator Ash, who delivered my pre-shift briefing with obvious nervousness. Tonight's convergence addresses observer protocols, he said. You may hear your designation used. Do not respond beyond standard protocols. Under no circumstances should you confirm or deny any statements about your personal utility to the assembly. I felt ice forming in my stomach. What does that mean? Exactly what it sounds like, Mr. Kincaid. You are the subject being discussed tonight. I sat in that wooden chair as 9 participants debated my fate like I was a piece of equipment being evaluated for continued use. They spoke of my observation consistency rating, my reality anchoring strength, and something they called my convergence compatibility index. The observer shows promise, one said. Minimal integration resistance could be elevated to full participation within 13 additional shifts. Elevation is premature, another countered. The observer serves better as anchor. Transformation would destabilize the local convergence geometry. Then we preserve him in current function? With modifications. The cognitive reinforcement is degrading his usefulness. We need more fluid boundaries. They were talking about changing me, about stripping away whatever the decontamination procedures were maintaining, about letting the convergence bleed into my mind until I became something like them. Or maybe one of them. At 3:13 a.m., one participant broke from the formation and approached to exactly 13 feet. Observer Adam Kincaid, it said, and I recognized the cultured, ancient voice from my first shift. You have been selected for acceleration. This is an honor granted to fewer than 1 in 10,000 candidates. Unable to confirm, I whispered, my throat tight with terror. You need not confirm. The choice has already been made. In 13 additional shifts, you will be offered a position within the convergence itself. You will transcend the limitations of singular consciousness. You will help guide the course of human events for the next century. You will become something more than the frightened man sitting in that chair. And if I refuse? The question violated protocols, but I had to ask. The participant was silent for a long moment. Refusal is not a defined parameter. You have been exposed to 17 classified convergence operations. You have witnessed 3 stabilizations and 1 rendering. You know the names of 6 bloodline representatives and the timeline for 14 major global restructuring events. You cannot be permitted to exist outside the convergence's direct control. So, I don't actually have a choice. Choice is an illusion we allow baseline humans to comfort themselves with. You passed beyond choice the moment you signed your contract. The only variable is the form your continuation takes. The participant returned to the formation, and the assembly concluded with a statement delivered in unison. The observer's trajectory is confirmed. Acceleration begins immediately. Cognitive reinforcement will be reduced by 30% each shift until integration readiness is achieved. When facilitator Ash collected me, I barely made it to the decontamination room before vomiting. The woman in the white coat administered the usual injections, but I could tell something was different. The dosages were smaller, the temple device applied for less time. Please, I begged her as she worked, please don't let them do this to me. Whatever they're planning. I cannot help you, she said flatly, but I saw her hands shake as she prepared the spinal electrodes. I am Facilitator Kane. I have no authorization to deviate from assigned protocols. Dr. Kane, the woman who'd administered my initial psychological evaluation. She'd been part of this from the beginning, watching me be slowly transformed into whatever they wanted me to become. Over the next 3 shifts, I felt the changes beginning. The decontamination procedures grew shorter and less effective. After each shift, I retained more of what I'd witnessed, understood more of what the participants discussed, felt less horror and more fascination with the convergence itself. I began dreaming in that unified voice they used, seeing geometric patterns in everyday objects, understanding conversations I overheard in terms of how they fit into larger patterns of control and influence. The world started looking different. Like a system that could be optimized if you just knew which pieces to move. That's when I knew I was losing myself, that the thing they were turning me into would wear my face and answer to my name but wouldn't be Adam Kincaid anymore. It would be something that thought orchestrating famines was just pattern optimization, that viewed human suffering as acceptable cost in pursuit of longer-term stability. During my 12th shift, I made my decision. The assembly that night discussed the Revelation timeline, apparently a planned sequence of carefully managed disclosures, designed to gradually acclimate humanity to the existence of the convergence over the next 30 years. They spoke of chosen prophets, manufactured messiahs, controlled revolutions, all designed to shepherd civilization toward voluntary integration with the hierarchies. By 2056, one participant explained, baseline human consciousness will have been sufficiently prepared. The barriers between convergence and consensus reality will thin to transparency. We will emerge from shadow into acknowledged authority. At 2:47 a.m., I performed my count and deliberately recorded a discrepancy that didn't exist. I reported 15 participants when there were only 13. The assembly noticed immediately. "The observer reports false data," the unified voice declared. "Clarify the error." "Unable to confirm," I responded, maintaining protocol while committing the violation. They knew. They understood exactly what I was doing. Forcing a crisis, sabotaging the observation, making myself unusable as an anchor. If I couldn't be trusted to maintain accurate counts, I had no value to the convergence. They'd have to eliminate me, which was better than becoming one of them. "The observer has chosen termination over transformation," one participant said, and I heard something almost like sadness in the ancient voice. "Unfortunate." His compatibility index was exceptionally high. "Shall we render him?" "No. Rendering requires formal violation of explicit convergence law. This is merely failure to perform function. Standard termination protocols apply." Two figures in golden masks emerged from the walls. The stabilizers I'd seen during my third shift. They moved toward me with terrible purpose, and I closed my eyes, waiting for whatever came next. But instead of pain, I felt hands on my shoulders. Human hands, trembling with urgency. "Run," Facilitator Kane whispered in my ear. "When I release you, run for the East Access Corridor. Don't stop. Don't look back." She injected something into my neck. The cold spread through my veins like ice water, and suddenly my mind felt clearer than it had in weeks. The convergence's influence burning away like morning fog. She'd given me a massive dose of the cognitive reinforcement, the full strength I'd received in my first decontamination. "Now," she hissed. I ran. Behind me, I heard the stabilizers pursuing, heard the participants calling out in that unified voice, heard alarms beginning to sound throughout the facility. But the reinforcement drug made everything sharp and fast. I navigated corridors I'd never seen before on pure instinct, following exit signs that appeared to be updated constantly on old stone walls. The East Access Corridor terminated at a blast door marked with warnings in 17 languages. I slammed into it, expecting it to be locked, but it swung open onto a narrow stairwell ascending into darkness. I climbed for what felt like hours, my lungs burning, the sound of pursuit echoing from below. The stairs ended at a rusted hatch. I shoved it open and emerged into pre-dawn light on a hillside half a mile from Fort Knox's main complex. Behind me, I heard the hatch slam shut and seal with a sound like thunder. I ran until I reached a highway, flagged down a trucker who asked no questions about the disheveled man desperately needing a ride anywhere away from here. I had nothing but the clothes I was wearing and the observer pin still attached to my collar, which I ripped off and threw out the truck window. That was 4 months ago. I've been moving constantly since, never staying in one place more than a few days, paying cash for everything, avoiding cameras, changing my appearance. The offshore account was emptied within hours of my escape, but I'd managed to withdraw $40,000 before they locked it down. It won't last forever. I know they're looking for me. I've seen the same unremarkable faces in 3 different cities, always maintaining exactly 13 feet of distance, always watching. The convergence doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive exposure risks. Sometimes I wonder if I should have just accepted the transformation, if becoming something other than human would have been easier than this paranoid half-life of constant flight. But then I remember the rendering, remember watching participants casually step over the frozen screams of their own kind captured in gold, and I know I made the right choice. I'm writing this account on a library computer, using a VPN that cycles through 17 different countries. When I finish, I'll upload it to every conspiracy forum, every alternative news site, every place where it might be dismissed as creative fiction but still plants seeds of truth in receptive minds. The convergence operates through secrecy. They maintain control by ensuring nobody believes the truth even when they hear it. But maybe, just maybe, If enough people read this and start asking questions, start looking for the patterns, the inconsistencies, the impossible coincidences that govern our world, maybe then the carefully maintained illusion will develop cracks. I'm finishing this in a motel outside Amarillo, Texas. It's 11:47 p.m., and I've been watching the parking lot for the last hour, counting and recounting the cars, unable to break the habit even now. 13 vehicles. Always 13, no matter how many times I count. That can't be coincidence. 3 days ago, I made a mistake. I'd been so careful for months, but exhaustion and the creeping paranoia finally broke my discipline. I called my sister from a burner phone just to hear a familiar voice, to confirm that some part of my old life still existed. The call lasted less than 2 minutes before I hung up, but it was enough. She told me something that turned my blood to ice. 2 men in dark suits had visited her a week ago, asking about my whereabouts. They'd shown identification from the Treasury Department and explained that I'd gone missing during a classified assignment, and they needed to ensure my safety. They'd left a number for her to call if she heard from me. "They seemed really concerned about you, Adam," she said, her voice worried. "They said you might be experiencing psychological distress, that you might believe things that aren't real. Already laying the groundwork to discredit me. Already making sure that if I did try to tell anyone what I'd witnessed, I'd be dismissed as mentally ill, traumatized by some vague classified work. The Convergence thought of everything. But they made one mistake. They assumed I'd broken completely from their influence, that Facilitator Kane's final massive dose of cognitive reinforcement had severed my connection to them entirely. They were wrong. I can still feel it sometimes in the spaces between thoughts. The convergence, like a frequency just below the range of normal human perception. I catch myself thinking in their terms, seeing patterns in the news that align exactly with the timelines they discussed. An economic minister resigning in France. That was on their list for transition. A pharmaceutical merger approved despite antitrust concerns. Part of the consolidation protocols for 2026. A drought in the Midwest intensifying despite predictions. Manufactured through the agricultural futures they debated. The worst part is understanding how it works, seeing the machinery of global control operating in plain sight, because now I know what to look for. Every major event that seems like chaos or accident or natural development is actually choreographed, anticipated, designed to move humanity along the revelation timeline toward the day when the convergence can step out of shadow and claim acknowledged authority. And I realize now that Facilitator Kane didn't just save me. She weaponized me. By giving me that final dose, she ensured I'd retain complete memories of everything I'd witnessed, while clearing the integration that would have made me complicit. She created the perfect witness. Someone who understands the convergence intimately enough to explain it convincingly, but remains human enough to care about exposing it. The question I keep returning to is, why? Why would a facilitator, someone deeply embedded in the system, help me escape? What could she possibly gain from creating a liability like me? I got my answer yesterday. I was using a library computer in Albuquerque, researching recent unexplained deaths of government employees, when my screen went black. Text appeared, white letters on darkness. Observer Kincaid. Facilitator Kane requires contact. Return to Gate 7 in 13 days. Alone. No harm will come to you. The convergence has been compromised. We need your help. The message disappeared after exactly 13 seconds. The screen returning to normal as if nothing had happened. I looked around the library frantically, but saw no one paying attention to me, no surveillance I could identify. They'd reached me through the computer itself, through infrastructure they controlled, proving they could find me whenever they wanted. But that last line that suggested something I hadn't considered, the convergence has been compromised. What if there were factions within the system? What if not all the participants, not all the bloodlines, not all the entities they served shared identical goals? What if Kane had saved me because she was part of some kind of internal resistance? I've spent the last 24 hours trying to decide what to do. Returning to Fort Knox is almost certainly a trap. Even if Kane's message was genuine, the stabilizers could be waiting, ready to render me into the golden floor alongside all the other failures and violations. I'd be erased from reality, My sister would receive notice that I died in some tragic but vague accident, and the convergence would continue its inexorable march toward total control. But if I don't go, I'll spend the rest of my life running. And more than that, I'll be abandoning the only person who risked everything to give me a chance at freedom. Whatever Kane's motivations, whatever her plans, she acted when she didn't have to. She showed mercy in a system designed to eliminate that weakness. I owe her at least the courtesy of hearing what she has to say. So tomorrow I start driving toward Kentucky. I'll arrive with 2 days to spare, which will give me time to scout the area, to watch for obvious ambushes, to prepare myself mentally for what might be my last act of free will. I'm bringing this account on a flash drive with instructions to publish it if I don't return to retrieve it within 72 hours. I've left copies with 3 different individuals who believe I'm a whistleblower with information about government financial crimes. Close enough to the truth to ensure they'll follow through if something happens to me. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back. But it also means the truth is out there now, circulating in the digital wilderness, ready to be dismissed as fiction by most but recognized as reality by those who've seen the patterns themselves. The convergence relies on plausible deniability, on the comfortable assumption that conspiracies of this magnitude can't possibly exist because humans can't keep secrets that well, can't coordinate that effectively, can't maintain control for that long. They're right, of course. Humans can't. But the things running the convergence aren't entirely human anymore, if they ever were. There's something that's learned to wear human faces, to speak in human voices, to mimic human concern while orchestrating inhuman agendas across timescales that make individual lives irrelevant. The gold in Fort Knox is real, but it's also a symbol, a battery, an anchor point for something that treats our entire civilization as a game to be won through patience and perfect positioning. And we're losing without even knowing we're playing. One final thing before I finish this and begin my drive east. If you work in government, if you have security clearance, if you've ever been recruited for a position that seemed too well paid for what it actually required, pay attention to the protocols they give you. Count how many times the number 13 appears. Notice whether the people giving you orders have faces you can clearly remember. Check whether the spaces you work in follow normal geometric rules or seem to connect to places that shouldn't physically exist. And if you're ever asked to sign a contract that includes the phrase acceptance of psychological and physiological risks inherent to observation of hierarchical convergence events, run. Run far and fast and don't look back, because they're recruiting you to anchor their influence into consensus reality, to make their impossible manipulations possible through the power of witness. Your observation is your consent. Your silence is your complicity. And your transformation is inevitable if you stay. I learned these lessons too late. Maybe you won't. It's 12:04 a.m. now, 13 minutes past the hour when I should have been starting a shift if I'd accepted my trajectory toward integration. Instead, I'm packing the few possessions I've acquired during 4 months of flight, preparing for a journey that will either free me completely or end me permanently. Either way, the truth is recorded. Either way, someone knows. The convergence operates in shadow, but shadows can only exist where there's light to cast them. This account is a candle. Small, easily extinguished, but real. Keep it burning. Adam Kincaid, former observer, Fort Knox Convergence Site, January 2026. I'm adding this section 72 hours later. I'm alive, barely. I went to Gate 7. The panel opened at exactly 11:47 p.m., just as it had during my employment. Facilitator Kane was waiting in the corridor, but she looked different. Thinner, older somehow, with a haunted quality that suggested she'd paid dearly for helping me escape. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't certain you would." "What's happening?" I asked. "What did you mean about the convergence being compromised?" She led me through corridors I'd never seen before, deeper than the vestibule, older than the stone walls I remembered. We descended to a level where the architecture looked ancient, pre-Columbian maybe, or older still, carved with symbols that seemed to writhe when viewed peripherally. "The convergence is fragmenting," Kane explained as we walked. "The 17 bloodlines are no longer aligned. 3 of them have begun pursuing what they call accelerated elevation. They want to collapse the revelation timeline from 30 years to 3. They're willing to risk mass psychological breakdown rather than wait for gradual acclimation. Why would they do that? Because they're dying. Not the bloodlines themselves, but the entities they made their bargain with in 1947. Those beings fed on certain forms of human consciousness. Specifically, the consciousness of people who existed in states of fear and uncertainty, while maintaining hope for transcendence. Modern humanity is becoming too cynical, too digital, too distributed for that kind of harvesting to remain efficient. We reached a chamber that made the vestibule look tiny by comparison. A vast underground cathedral carved from solid gold. Its walls inscribed with the complete history of the convergence going back not decades but centuries. Millennia, maybe. This is the primary anchor point, Kane said. Fort Knox was built around this chamber, not the other way around. The bullion depository above is just camouflage. This is where the original bargain was sealed, where the gold standard of souls was established. In the center of the chamber stood 13 figures I recognized from my shifts. Permanent participants, the ones who appeared at every assembly. But they weren't moving, weren't speaking. They stood frozen in their geometric pattern, faces visible now in the golden light, and I understood with horror that they'd been trapped there for decades, maybe longer, serving as eternal anchors for the convergence itself. They volunteered, Kane said, seeing my expression. The original bloodline representatives, back in 1947. They became permanent fixtures, living batteries that maintain the connection between the entities and consensus reality. But the strain is breaking them. Look closer. I forced myself to examine the frozen figures. Cracks ran through their skin like fractured porcelain, and through the cracks, I could see light bleeding out. The same golden radiance that had emerged during the stabilization I'd witnessed. They were literally coming apart, the decades of service finally exceeding what even enhanced human forms could withstand. When they fail completely, the anchor point will collapse, Kane continued. The convergence will lose its primary connection to our reality. The entities will be cut off, unable to influence events except through their remaining bloodline descendants, who are nowhere near powerful enough to maintain global control alone. So why bring me here? What can I possibly do about this? She turned to face me fully, and I saw tears in her eyes. Because you're an observer who rejected transformation. That makes you unique. You have exposure to the convergence but no integration with it. You can serve as a witness to what comes next without being compromised by it. What comes next? The collapse is happening in 3 days during the next scheduled assembly. The accelerationists have sabotaged the anchor point to speed up the timeline. When those 13 figures finally shatter, there will be a backlash. A pulse of released energy that will affect everyone who's ever been exposed to the convergence. Thousands of people, facilitators, observers, bloodline descendants, anyone who's ever attended an assembly or worked in the program. What will happen to them? We don't know exactly, but based on the mathematics, we expect spontaneous reality displacement. People experiencing the same moment multiple times, geometric impossibilities manifesting in consensus space, maybe complete breaks from linear causality. A localized apocalypse of consciousness. I felt my legs weaken. You're telling me the end of the world is 3 days away? Not the end of the world, just the end of the convergence's ordered control over it. What comes after could be worse. Total chaos, reality instability, the entities breaking through without any restraint. Or it could be liberation. A chance for humanity to develop without manipulation, without orchestrated events guiding every major decision. And you want me to witness this? I want you to survive it. You're clean enough that the backlash might not affect you as severely. And if someone doesn't document what actually happens, the surviving bloodline elements will rewrite the narrative, will turn it into natural disaster or mass psychosis or whatever explanation lets them maintain control over the aftermath. She handed me a device that looked like the observation tablet but heavier, more complex. This will record everything across multiple dimensional frequencies. Hide it somewhere safe. When the collapse happens, turn it on and point it at the epicenter. Record the whole event. And then what? Then you run. Again, farther this time, and you make sure the recording gets distributed to people who can interpret it. Physicists, consciousness researchers, anyone who might understand what they're seeing. I took the device, my hands shaking. You're asking me to document the apocalypse. I'm asking you to document the truth, whatever that turns out to be. We stood in silence for a long moment, surrounded by the frozen witnesses of a 79-year conspiracy, feeling the weight of what was coming. Finally, I asked the question that had been gnawing at me since her message appeared on my screen. Why did you really save me? What made you decide to risk everything? Kane smiled sadly. Because I was an observer once, too, 23 years ago, and when they offered me transformation or termination, I chose transformation because I was too afraid to die. I became Facilitator Kane, and I've spent 2 decades helping recruit and process and modify people just like I was modified. I wanted to believe I was part of something meaningful, something that would guide humanity toward a better future. She gestured at the frozen figures, at the cracks spreading through their porcelain skin. But this is what we've been serving. This is what the convergence really is. Not enlightened beings guiding us toward transcendence, but parasites feeding on our consciousness, using us up and discarding us when we're no longer useful. You had the courage to refuse. That made you worth saving. I left Fort Knox 3 hours ago with the recording device hidden in a waterproof case. I'm currently driving west again, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the epicenter of what's coming. In 67 hours, the convergence will collapse. Reality will fracture. And I'll be there with a camera, documenting the moment when humanity's hidden masters finally lose their grip. If this addendum is published, it means I survived. It means the recording is out there somewhere, evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away. If it's not published, it means the backlash was worse than Kane predicted. It means I'm gone, along with everyone else who got too close to the machinery of control. Either way, the truth will be known. The convergence is ending. What comes after is up to us. Keep counting, keep watching, keep questioning. And whatever you do, never accept the comfortable lie that the world runs on simple chaos and coincidence. Someone is always counting. The question is whether they're counting us or we're counting them. Adam Kincaid, January 2026.